I've played many great and memorable games in my life. Many of them I would consider something special, but I don't use the word masterpiece lightly to describe some of the ones I feel are the best and most important in the medium. That's why I'm especially eager to talk about Rule of Rose. If you've heard of Rule of Rose, it's very likely because of the controversy surrounding it. In the US, the game was denied publishing by Sony, as they wanted the disturbing themes to be toned down in order to better suit Sony's corporate image. Eventually, Punchline, Rule of Rose's developer, was able to have their game published under Atlas without any issue. However, Rule of Rose would become the face of controversy in Europe. In mid-October of 2006, Italian magazine Panorama put the game on that issue's cover with the sensationalist headline, "He who buries the little girl wins." The journalist who wrote the article, Guido Castellano, further condemned the game by claiming it included erotic and sadomasochistic content. Of course, none of these claims are accurate, and the author of the article had not so much as watched a playthrough of the game. Unfortunately, that did stop these false claims from spreading like wildfire through Europe. This included yet another provocative cover page, this time from British publication The Times. They referred to Rule of Rose as a violent children's game, despite the fact that Peggy had already designated the game with a 16 rating. This controversy eventually led to the cancellation of a planned release in the UK, as well as in Australia and New Zealand. Now that you know what Rule of Rose isn't about, just what is it about? It begins with a girl, as many of these treacherous tales do, of 19 years of age named Jennifer. She's a young English woman during the year 1930. Shortly after the death of her parents, she finds herself at the Rose Garden Orphanage. She soon discovers that the children inhabitants are quite disturbed, to say the least. So disturbed, in fact, that they shove Jennifer into a coffin, and she's soon taken aboard an airship. Then, she's unwillingly joined the Red Crayon Aristocrat Club, where they almost follow the Rule of Rose decreed by the Princess of the Red Rose. If Jennifer wishes to rediscover her lost memories, she'll need to partake in the Aristocrat Club's whims. The soundtrack for the game is absolutely fantastic. The strings and piano evoke a feeling of melancholy, tension, beauty, and fear at all the right moments, sometimes even all at once. The music perfectly captures all of the complex emotions that the story presents. One way I've seen the gameplay described is as a long series of fetch quests. Truthfully, that isn't inaccurate. Much of the gameplay revolves around finding key objects in order to find more key objects to progress the story. Oftentimes, this requires you to use your canine companion's nose to track down the items you'll need. You can also find healing items this way. Finding these objects with this mechanic is an interesting idea, but it's also tedious and repetitive. I personally didn't mind the tedium too much, but I can understand why people often cite this as a negative towards the game. What's often considered the worst aspect of the game, however, is the combat. You have to hold down the R1 button and press X to attack, which feels awkward. On top of that, Jennifer's attacks are inconsistent, and there's no way to make the attacking more precise. Long-range weapons are a little better, but still not very consistent in pattern. If all of that wasn't bad enough, the collision detection sometimes feels like a crapshoot. Even when I knew I was right up against an enemy, there were times when my attacks just flat out refused to hit. Instead of being a challenge, the combat feels more like a struggle, as though you're fighting against the game, as opposed to alongside it. Apparently, the poor combat system is due to budget and time limitations. While less than ideal combat makes some sense considering Jennifer's lack of experience, I feel like one could create a fine-tuned fighting system, while still making it feel reasonable from an unexperienced combatant. But with all that being said and done, I feel as though the narrative more than makes up for subpar gameplay. Almost immediately I was hooked into the story, trying to figure out what was real, and what wasn't. I hardly thought about the repetitive fetch quests because I was so eager to see what direction the story would go next. I even found myself not minding the weak combat mechanics most of the time. And this is where I'll give a spoiler disclaimer. While I strongly encourage anyone interested in this game to go in blind, I also feel I can't do the story justice without extensively talking about its plot and themes. One of the most provocative aspects of the story is how it sharply subverts the idea of childhood innocence. A significant way this is demonstrated is with its use of fairy tale motifs. Jennifer is constantly described as an unlucky and lonely girl as she goes through her perilous mission. It's it's not unlike the heroines of fables that must embark on a treacherous journey to find their happy ending. There's also the fact that fairy tales are often associated with childish whimsy and excitement, but in actuality, many of them can be quite brutal, with graphic depictions of violence and gore, and endings with gruesome revenge. This theme of the dark side of childhood innocence is why the game received so much attention from the media in the first place, albeit in a highly sensationalized and falsified manner. But while the game is very disturbing at times, often exaggerated in ways that would only exist in a horror tale, there is a grain of truth at its core. Kids can be cruel. More specifically, at least when it comes to this game, little girls can be cruel. And the fact that they're children does nothing to mitigate the psychological damage they inflict. Even kids who are generally nice can have moments of irrationality towards their peers. Jennifer even admits that she took on a cold and standoffish demeanor as a child in order to attempt to cope with her feelings of isolation and loneliness. Perhaps if the adults around her did more than just call her a filthy wretch, things could have turned out differently for everyone. And the ultimate reason as to why and how these girls can inflict such cruel behavior is because they're too innocent to really understand the gravity of their actions. Children not only have a low level of emotional maturity and intelligence, but also a limited perspective on the world due to their lack of life experience. It's why the red crayon aristocrats can so easily inflict their cruelty by order of their princess. To them, their cult is just a game, and they're all just playing their part. Childhood trauma is also a contributing factor into their behavior. Seeing as how all of the children are orphans, it's a given that what little past they have were not pleasant. It's also shown that at least 2 of the girls in the orphanage were sexually abused by their headmaster. All of this combined with a lack of proper adult guidance leads to them lashing out in unhealthy ways. However, none of this is shown to excuse the torture that Jennifer endured, especially since she too experienced her fair share of trauma, but didn't brutalize people who had nothing to do with it. And it certainly doesn't excuse them for killing Jennifer's beloved puppy Brown. That's why it's oh so extremely satisfying to see her finally snap at them, giving the Princess of the Red Rose a much-deserved beating, and calling them out for being the monsters they are. She even calls herself out for tolerating their actions for as long as she did in the first place. And so everyone gets what they deserve in the end, leading to a satisfying conclusion for our heroine, right? Well, there's a bit more to it than that. After Jennifer snaps at the aristocrats, they tell her that they've kicked the former princess from her throne, and that Jennifer is now their leader. Then, they all apologize for their past behavior. In any other situation, I would have scoffed at their apology. Why should I believe that they're truly remorseful for their cruelty, when they're probably just afraid that they'll be the next target of Jennifer's violent wrath? But they did all agree to outcast their princess from the club she created. Perhaps Jennifer's outburst was a much-needed wake-up call, one that should have been provided by the adults in the orphanage. It's a genuinely chilling scene when they're all massacred before they had the chance to repent. And that leads me to a part of the story that lingered with me the most, Wendy. Wendy is the source of most of the terrible things that happened in the game, from Jennifer's hellish life at the orphanage to the murder of almost all of the children. And all of it was because of her jealous and possessive feelings towards Jennifer. Wendy may be a child, but that doesn't make her any less of a terrible human being. But by the end of the story, I couldn't find myself hating her. Yes, she did unforgivably horrible things. There's no denying or excusing that. Still, she was a child that didn't know how to handle these new emotions of infatuation and jealousy. It seems silly for even a child to be jealous of a puppy, especially since the love Jennifer felt for Brown was a very different kind of love than what she felt for Wendy. But think about how many real-life children feel jealousy towards a new sibling because they think their parents will no longer love the older child. From an adult's perspective, it's a foolish notion, but it doesn't seem that way from the underdeveloped mind of a child. There's also sympathy to be had on account of Wendy being a sickly orphan, which is what likely gave her abandonment and attachment issues. It's probably also why she pursued Jennifer. Wendy saw a lonely girl just like herself, which created a bond between the two. Unfortunately, that's what also led to her toxic emotions and the destructive ways she went about trying to cope with them. Again, had she received proper adult guidance and someone to talk to about these feelings, there's a good chance none of the events of the game would have happened. During the epilogue chapter, I was left with some complex emotions. There's a very sad and somber tone as we see things how they really were, even after all of the terror, real and imaginary. And I think this feeling that the game gives to the player is meant to mirror Jennifer's own melancholic and complicated feelings. To experience a living hell from the person she trusted the most, and that trauma will be with her forever. But there's also no denying that she and Wendy felt genuine love for one another, or at least as much as children can understand romantic love. Either way, Wendy was just as much of a source of joy and salvation for Jennifer as she was a source of sorrow and pain. And there's no way Jennifer, or the player, can have one without the other. It's clear that Jennifer has her regrets and things that she wishes she could have done differently. But she can't change the past. All she could do is take what she learned and hope for a better future. And I think the fact that she's able to move on at all after everything she's experienced gives her a great level of strength. I had next to no knowledge about Rule of Rose before I played it, and didn't really have any positive or negative expectations. By the end, I was left emotionally affected in a way that not many games have left to me before. I thought that the story was so fantastic that I was able to look past the lackluster gameplay. It seems strange to praise a game for having a story that's so good you can ignore the actual game aspect of it. And most of the time I would agree. A great game should use the unique nature of interactivity to tell its story. But there are exceptions to just about everything, and Rule of Rose is one I feel strongly about. I know not everyone will agree with me, and are unable to tolerate the gameplay enough for the sake of the story, but it's something I can definitely understand. But I strongly urge anyone interested in an emotionally and psychologically complex story to give this one a chance. It's just a damn shame that the game is so obscenely expensive now, and that neither Atlas nor Sony appear to be interested in re-releasing it in any form. I can understand in a way, though. While I think people are more open-minded when it comes to certain topics in video games, the way the narrative focuses on the young children characters and what happens to them might still be a touchy subject. However, I think if we want to accept video games as an art form and storytelling medium, we have to allow stories that might make us uncomfortable in ways that we aren't usually made to do so. There's nothing wrong with someone not finding it as a game for them, but I still think it's a story worth telling. So whatever way you could find to play Rule of Rose, I highly encourage you to do so. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to click like, and subscribe if you want to see more.